The first thing I sealed was the spillway elevator, and I did it because of the wind. That probably sounds backward. People hear the title of what happened and imagine I was boarding up doors against the infected, dragging chains over gates while the valley burned below me. It was not like that. The valley was still green then. School buses were still running. People were still stopping at Della's for coffee on Route 8 and complaining about fuel prices and snowpack forecasts and whether the governor had waited too long to declare anything. The outbreak was still mostly a thing on radios and televisions. It had names in those days: clusters, incidents, civil disturbances, quarantine events. They only started calling it an outbreak when it was already moving through counties like weather. No, the first thing I sealed was the spillway elevator because the west wind came up through that shaft every afternoon and carried grit into the machine room. The old door never sat right in its frame. You could hear it rattle 2 floors away. I cut a sheet of neoprene in the maintenance shop, set it around the jamb, and dogged the wheel handle down until the latch pulled tight. After that, the hum in the elevator motor housing softened, and the whole lower gallery seemed to exhale. I remember standing there with my flashlight under one arm and a gasket punch in my pocket, listening to the concrete settle. That old dam always had a deep internal sound to it, not ominous, just patient. Water pressing where it ought to press. Small leaks finding their drains. Air moving through penstock chambers and cable chases. I had not been inside Rookstone Dam in almost 15 years, and it still smelled the same as when I was 20 and doing summer work there for my father. Cold stone, dust, machine oil gone sweet with age, and the faint mineral smell of reservoir water on steel. By then, the outbreak had already crossed the state line to our west. They said 2 hospitals had locked their loading bays. They said sheriff's deputies were abandoning checkpoints because people kept leaving their cars and coming on foot through orchards and drainage ditches. They said a lot of things. Most of what traveled fastest in those days was either incomplete or wrong. But one thing was plain enough, even from the broken pieces. People were moving inland, and our valley sat in a bowl with only 3 practical roads in or out. I was 46 then, maintenance superintendent for the Tri-County Water and Irrigation District. It sounds larger than it was. Mostly it meant pumps, lift stations, canal gates, telemetry cabinets, chlorination rooms, and field calls from farmers who believed electricity had a moral obligation to behave. I had trained originally in industrial electrical work, then picked up enough hydraulics and civil maintenance over the years to become useful in places where budgets were thin and old systems still mattered. In a normal life, or what used to count as one, I spent more time with switchgear than with people. The district office sat on the north end of Alder Bend, a flat little town with a hardware store, a clinic, a tire shop, a feed mill, and a high school whose baseball field backed onto a drainage canal. Our valley ran north-south along a cold river fed by snowmelt, hemmed in by ridges of dry pine and granite. The Hydroelectric dam was 23 miles upstream from town, built in the late 1950s, shut down in the early 2000s after a combination of silt load, licensing costs, and one bad flood year made the county decide that buying power was cheaper than making it. The reservoir still held. The concrete was still sound. The lower service road still existed if you knew where to turn off. But the turbines had been idle a long time, and the place had become one more piece of practical history people drove past without seeing. The morning I went up there, I did not think I was saving anyone. I thought I was making an option. That distinction matters to me now. The valley had 1 active water treatment plant and 2 backup wells. If the roads jammed, if the substation started tripping, if panic buying became something uglier, Then every system we took for granted would begin failing and the ordinary order systems fail. First, the small conveniences, then the deliveries, then the staffing, then the maintenance. A place like Rookstone had advantages no town meeting ever quite appreciated, because the place seemed obsolete. It had elevation, a single access road, gravity-fed raw water, machine shops, fuel tanks, bunk rooms from the old operator days, thick concrete, radio line of sight to most of the valley, and enough original equipment left in place that a careful person could improvise. Not restore it, exactly. I want to be honest about that. Nobody walks into an abandoned hydro plant with a wrench and a good attitude and brings it back to full generation in a weekend. But you can do smaller things. You can isolate circuits. You can run a diesel. You can reopen old domestic water lines. You can make a building dry, defensible, and habitable. You can build a battery room. You can turn the old cafeteria freezer into cold storage if the compressor still has life. You can weld gates shut in places the blueprints say are access points, and everyone else has forgotten. That morning the roads were still open. The sheriff's office was still posting notices about curfew being under evaluation. Parents were still picking up their kids from school, though a little earlier than usual. I stopped at District Yard 6, hooked up the flatbed trailer, and loaded what made sense without drawing attention. 2 drums of diesel, 3 coils of chain, a pallet of bottled water, a MIG welder, rod stock, spare padlocks, 2 cases of grease cartridges, a crate of old VHF handhelds we kept for flood season, 4 deep cycle batteries, rolls of hardware cloth, and a gray tool chest with wheels that always wanted to drift left. I also took 6 boxes of nitrile gloves and every flashlight I could find. People remember those early days as noisy, but I remember the opposite. Sound thinned out. You'd pull onto a county road at noon and hear your own tires on aggregate. A gas station canopy would be full, but nobody would be saying much. In the office, we still answered phones, still printed work orders, still wrote dates at the top of legal pads. But the pauses between ordinary tasks kept stretching. The radio in my truck would crackle with dispatch traffic from 3 counties over, then go dead for 20 minutes while I drove under cottonwoods just beginning to turn. Every parking lot seemed to have 1 cart left in the wrong place. I called my sister Anna before I lost cell coverage. She lived on the east side of the valley with her husband and 2 boys in a house near the old feed road. She taught 7th grade science and had a steadier mind than most people I knew. When our mother was dying, Anna was the one who learned how to clean the oxygen concentrator and keep the medication notebook in straight lines. I told her where I was going, and she was quiet for a moment. "You think it's that bad?" she asked. "I think it gets bad fast once staffing drops," I said, "and I think high ground with plumbing is worth looking at. Is this district business?" "Not yet." "That means no. That means not officially." She let out a breath. I could hear one of the boys in the background asking if school was canceled tomorrow. "Should I come up there?" she asked. "Not yet. Elias." She only used my full name when she was trying not to argue. "I'm just checking systems," I said. "That's true. If it's nothing, I come back tonight and you get to tell me I've started old man prepping early. And if it isn't nothing, pack for cold weather, quietly." There was another pause. The line crackled. I remember looking out through the windshield at the slope above the district yard, brittle grass laying one direction in the wind, and feeling very tired all of a sudden. "All right," she said. "Call me from the mountain if you can." That was day 11. The upper gate to Rookstone had a county chain on it, and a lock so old I opened it with a shot of graphite and 2 tries. Pine needles had drifted deep against the inside of the fence. The signboard listing safety rules had gone white and powdery with sun. When I drove over the crest road, The reservoir opened to my left in a sheet of dull silver under overcast light, and beyond it, the ridge lines layered off into blue. On the right, the spillway dropped away in a long concrete tongue, streaked with mineral stains and last year's weed growth. You could feel the height there, even if you didn't look. The powerhouse sat below the dam face, half buried in slope, its windows clouded with age, and its loading bay chained. Above it, intake towers rose out of the reservoir like square gray chimneys. Downstream, the tail race channel cut a darker line through the rock and scrub before joining the river again. I parked on the apron and stood for a minute listening. No birds right near the building, just wind and one loose piece of sheet metal ticking somewhere out of sight. There's a kind of relief in entering a machine that has been sleeping a long time. It doesn't ask anything of you immediately. It just waits to see whether you remember its shape. Inside, dust lay thick on everything above waist height, and hardly at all below, where rodents had trafficked for years. The old control room still had its mimic panel, enamel lines tracing feeder paths, brass labels, breaker handles tagged out decades ago, and dead analog meters with yellowed faces. One corner held a rack of SCADA equipment from a retrofit that had briefly tried to make the old plant modern before economics caught up with it. In the break room, somebody had left a ceramic mug in a cabinet, upside down on a paper towel. The operator's duty board still had names written in grease pencil so faint I could barely read them. My father's was not there. He worked relief shifts, maintenance, the practical corners of the place. The men who wrote their names big on boards were usually the ones people remembered. I checked structure first, because structure tells you whether the rest of your imagination is a waste of time. The lower galleries were dry except for the usual seepage to drains. No fresh spalling I didn't already know from inspection reports. Penstock valves stiff but intact. Domestic water tank empty. Service lift frozen in place. Diesel tanks in the annex mostly dry. One at perhaps 15% if the old gauge could be trusted. Generator room cleaner than I expected. Somebody from county emergency management must have used it for drills at some point, and then stopped. By noon, I had a legal pad full of things that were possible, and a second page of things that were not. That's how I've always worked. You can get a lot of peace out of separating the two. Possible. Shelter 50 people in real beds if we use the old operator's wing and conference rooms. More on cots. Restore toilets on 2 floors with domestic line work and a booster pump. Build kitchen around propane camp stoves in the maintenance bay with exhaust fans running. Pull raw water from auxiliary intake and treat it on a small scale with district stock and improvised filtration. Get radio mast live with battery bank. Fence the downstream approach. Use the reservoir road for controlled deliveries. Reactivate 1 workshop crane. Heat selected rooms with diesel space heaters and scavenged insulation. Maybe, if we got lucky, and Theo Baird was still alive and willing, wake 1 small auxiliary turbine, or at least use the exciter room and old switchgear as structured distribution. Not possible. Restoring full hydro generation for valley use, holding off a crowd if people discovered the place too early, housing everybody, saving the town and the dam together without choosing one over the other. The last one sat there on the page for a long time. I didn't write it at first. I just knew it. Then I wrote it anyway because I've found that if you don't put a hard fact in ink, your conscience starts negotiating with it. Around 1 in the afternoon, I got a radio call from Marta Singh. Marta ran chemistry at the Valley Treatment Plant. She was not district staff exactly, more contract operations. But in a small valley, that distinction never meant much. She had a compact way of talking, efficient and dry, and she trusted data more than she trusted temperament, which made her restful company. "You took half my gloves," she said without greeting. "I left you bleach. I have bleach. I need gloves. You need elevation more." That got a short laugh out of her. "Salcedo says the highway checkpoint north of Miller Cut folded," she said. "County's saying road accident. CHP says staffing shortage. My cousin in Fresno says the hospitals are locking triage entrances after dark." I told her where I was. There was a pause, then a faint paper sound, as if she were turning down a radio or closing a notebook. "How viable?" she asked. "More than town hall," I said. "That is a low bar. It has water. It has rooms. If we can isolate the domestic line and get one of the boilers limping, it has heat. What about power? Working on it." "You want help?" It wasn't a question. "Yes," I said, "but not a convoy. Quiet people. Practical people. Meaning not your friend Dwayne from Fleet Services who buys generators before every winter and forgets extension cords." "Exactly. I can be there in 2 hours," she said. "I'll bring sample kits, test strips, and food that hasn't gone sentimental in a pantry. Bring blankets if you have room." Irritatingly, I already thought of that. By dusk, she arrived in her old Subaru with the back seats folded down, a water test case riding beside a carton of canned chickpeas, and 4 military wool blankets that smelled faintly of cedar storage. With her came Jonah Alvarez, a district lineman in his 30s, who looked perpetually wind-burned and could climb anything with bolts in it, and Leon Booker from Municipal Transit, who kept the town's buses and snow equipment alive with improvised parts and ordinary patience. Leon was a large man who moved slowly enough that people often mistook him for tired. He was never tired. He just refused unnecessary motions. The 4 of us stood in the empty control room while evening light went blue through the dirty windows. Jonah looked around at the dead panels and said, "Well, it's ugly enough to be useful." Marta set her test kits down on the old dispatch desk. "What's the plan?" I remember hesitating, not because I lacked one, but because saying it aloud made it more real than the legal pad had. "The plan," I said, "is to make this place livable before anyone else realizes it can be." Nobody argued. That was how I knew we were past the point of pretending this was just preparedness. That first night we didn't sleep much. Not from fear. There was simply too much to do while the road still existed. Jonah and I opened panel covers by headlamp and started tracing what circuits could be isolated from corroded runs and what had to be treated as dead forever. Leon drained stale fuel from the auxiliary generator and cursed gently at a filter housing that cracked in his hand. Marta walked the domestic water lines from the old operator's kitchen to the restroom stack, making notes in a pocket notebook and muttering to herself about scaling and bacterial risk. Around midnight, we sat on overturned buckets in the machine shop and ate canned peaches with pocket knives because nobody had thought to bring spoons. There are little moments that stay brighter than the large ones. Leon wiping peach syrup off his thumb with a blue shop towel. Jonah holding up a cracked relay and saying, "They built this when men still trusted screws." Marta in 2 sweaters, hair tied back with a rubber band from a produce bundle, reading an old wall chart about emergency flashboards as if she meant to take an exam on it. Outside, the reservoir made almost no sound. The intake towers showed as darker shapes against the sky. Far below, the valley towns still had power. You could see the spread of them at night from the Crest Road. Alder Bend, then Fallon Cross, then the ribbon along Route 8, where truck stops and a motel made a brighter knot. I stood up there for a while after 1 in the morning, cold enough to sting the nose, the kind of cold that comes ahead of real autumn. I thought about driving back down and getting Anna and the boys right then. I thought about every person in the valley who did not know this place existed except as a line on an old-school field trip map. I thought about the hard arithmetic of beds, potable water, and calories. There are truths a person can understand abstractly for years and still not be prepared to feel in their chest. Capacity was one of those truths for me. By morning we had water in one sink, though it came rusty first and smelled of old pipe. We had power in 2 rooms from a battery bank and inverter assembly Jonah built out of district stock and a marine charger. We had the lower gate chained from the inside and the upper gate hidden by the simple trick of parking my flatbed across it, so nobody could open it without noise. We had not yet sealed the place. Not really. But we had taken the first steps. On day 10, I went back down to town. That was the worst drive I made the whole time, worse than later runs through stalled traffic and smoke, because the valley still looked normal enough to make me feel like a fool. School was closed, yes, and there were more sheriff cruisers than usual posted at intersections. Della's had switched to takeout only. The grocery store had a line, but the banners across Main Street were still up from harvest days. Somebody was leaf-blowing the sidewalk outside the real estate office. At the clinic, a man in scrubs was smoking beside the dumpster, as if it were any strained day in flu season. I stopped at district headquarters and found 3 messages waiting on my desk, 2 from pump stations and 1 from county emergency management asking for district asset status. There was a briefing in the conference room. I attended it, because not attending would have made me visible. The county administrator looked gray around the mouth and said the state was coordinating. The sheriff said residents should remain calm and avoid travel unless necessary. A representative from public health read from a printout about exposure routes and symptom onset, pausing twice because her voice kept tightening. Nobody used the word dead. Nobody used the word zombie, obviously. That belonged to jokes and late-night movies, not a county building with fluorescent lights buzzing over a tray of untouched grocery store muffins. When it was my turn, I gave a concise report on district resiliency, backup well fuel levels, vulnerable substations, telemetry limitations, reservoir storage. I did not mention Rookstone except as non-generating dam infrastructure, secure and not currently in service. After the meeting, Sheriff Salcido caught me in the hall. Tom Salcido had been deputy enough years that his face seemed shaped by hat brims and windshield glare. He was not dramatic. His calm came from repetition. He had seen enough domestic disasters, car wrecks, overdoses, and winter rescues to know that panic mostly wastes oxygen. "You looked guilty in there," he said. "That's just my face." "No. Guilty's lower in the jaw." We stood by the copy room. Somebody down the hall was arguing softly into a phone about insulin delivery. "You've got something," he said. "I've got options." "That mean the old dam?" I glanced at him. He shrugged. "My grandfather worked masonry there," he said. "I know how practical men think." I should have lied. Instead, I said, "It's structurally sound." "How many?" "Maybe 60 without misery." He nodded once, not liking the number, because numbers never improve moral questions. "You planning to tell the county? Are they planning to secure roads and supply lines?" He looked past me into the conference room, where the administrator was now talking to a television crew he had asked not to come. "That a no?" I said. "That's a county answer," he said. "Not the same thing." Then he leaned a shoulder against the wall and lowered his voice. "If you're doing it, do it all the way. Half-secured places kill people. Folks come late, tired, desperate. Leave a gate open. Assume somebody else checked the fuel, and then you have a bad version of mercy." "I know." "Do you?" I thought of the legal pad in the control room. I thought of Anna. "I'm learning fast," I said. He nodded again. "I can spare 1 deputy for 2 days, maybe 3. After that, I won't control my own schedule." "Who?" "Me," he said. That was how he came into it. The rest of day 10 passed in a blur of loading and choosing. Choosing took the longest. In stories, people always talk about what they grabbed, but not about what they left in plain sight, because weight, space, and time are all stricter than affection. We took boxed dry goods from the high school cafeteria with the principal's written permission and a grim little joke about the state finally finding a use for shelf-stable lentils. We took cots from summer fire camp storage. We took diesel from district reserves, chlorine from treatment stock, rolled insulation, tarps, first aid kits, paper maps, can openers, extension cords, mouse traps, toilet paper, bleach, coffee, and every battery-powered lantern I could lay hands on. Marta insisted on hauling 3 plastic tubs of lab glassware, and then spent 20 minutes convincing me they mattered more than decorative things like morale. She was right, though I still think morale needed representation. I went by Anna's house near sundown. The boys had packed badly, which is what boys do under pressure. One had brought 3 chapter books and no socks. The other had packed a baseball glove, a handheld game with no charger, and an entire pillow. Anna had 2 duffels ready, plus a milk crate of family documents and my mother's photo albums wrapped in a towel. She saw me look at them. "I know," she said. "No, bring them." My brother-in-law, Pete, met us in the driveway with his truck already loaded. Pete managed orchards on the east slope and had the practical reserve of a man who measured years in irrigation, frost, and labor. He was not sentimental about property, which in a time like that was a useful trait. "I can keep the pumps going another week if power holds," he said. "Don't," I said. "Not if roads start closing." He rubbed the back of his neck and looked toward the hills. "People will come through the groves," he said. "I know." He nodded. "Then I'd rather be above them." We drove in a loose convoy up the mountain in growing dark. On the switchbacks, we lost cell service for good. The boys counted deer by the roadside until they grew quiet and fell asleep against their seatbelts. Below us, the valley lights came on one grid at a time. That night at the dam, there were 12 of us, enough to hear human life in the place again. Theo Baird arrived the next morning in a county pickup with 2 plastic bins of manuals and a lunch pail older than Jonah. He had been chief operator at Rookstone before decommissioning, then drifted through a half-retirement doing inspections and volunteer museum work nobody visited. He must have been 72, maybe 73, all tendon and capillaries, his hearing unreliable in one ear and perfect in the other depending on what you said. When he stepped into the control room, he stopped so suddenly I nearly walked into him. "Well," he said after a while, "they left more than I expected." "Can you help?" I asked. He glanced at me. "Boy, I can judge you for trying. That's not the same thing, but it's in the family." Then he smiled just enough that I knew I'd been forgiven for bringing him into one more hard thing. The next several days had a different texture than anything that came after. They were busy, but cleanly busy. Work still led to visible results. There was a kind of luxury in that. We divided ourselves by competence rather than preference. Marta and Anna took over domestic systems and inventory, which quickly expanded from water testing into kitchens, linens, sanitation, and 1,000 details between people can stay here and people can stay here without getting sick or turning on one another. Jonah and I handled electrical distribution, battery charging, lighting, the radio room, and later the ugly, delicate business of trying to wake portions of the old auxiliary hydro system. Leon worked on engines, heaters, lifts, hand trucks, and whatever broke while we were trying to fix something else. Theo moved through all of it with old operator knowledge, touching railings, opening cabinets, finding spare parts in places memory had stored them more accurately than inventory ever did. Salcedo took the road and gate logic. He was good at boundaries because he respected how easily they failed. He mapped the approach, set turnaround points, stashed spike strips we hoped never to use, and had us weld the downstream maintenance stairwell shut from inside the powerhouse where the seam would be less obvious. He also made us practice arrivals after dark, without headlights, which annoyed Jonah and saved us trouble later. We kept the boys busy by giving them serious tasks with limited consequences, counting blankets, sorting canned goods by date, labeling lantern shelves. They liked the radio room best because of the headphones and knobs. At night, they slept in the old operator's dormitory under wool blankets, one by the wall, one nearest the door, because they still believed that mattered. By day 8, the place began to feel less like a rescue idea and more like a functioning outpost. We had toilets on the second floor, though we posted strict rules about water use, and I winced every time someone flushed. We had a hot meal schedule built around propane and whatever could be made in large pots. We had domestic water running through improvised filtration and chlorination that Marta tested morning and evening with a seriousness approaching religion. We had battery lighting in all the main corridors and motion lights rigged over the loading bay so we wouldn't waste lamps. We had a chalkboard by the kitchen listing tasks, fuel levels, and radio times. We also had our first arguments. They were not dramatic. Most human strain arrives in practical language. Anna thought we were underestimating laundry. She was right. Jonah wanted to strip copper from dead runs too early, and Theo nearly took his head off for cannibalizing history before necessity votes for it. Leon thought we should salvage bus seats from transit storage for the dining hall because people eat longer than they stand, which was such a Leon sentence that nobody contradicted him. I wanted to keep intake information about the dam restricted. Marta asked restricted from whom, exactly, when we were already bringing people in. Salcedo answered before I could. From crowds, he said. There are no crowds yet, she said. There will be. She looked at him for a long second, then down at the latest water results in her notebook. Then we need criteria before fear writes them for us. That stayed with me. Criteria before fear writes them. So we wrote them. Not old house rules, not folklore, not secret etiquette. Capacity tables, medical risks, child needs, skill needs, fuel burn estimates, bedding counts, caloric use, water per head, access road exposure. We sat in the former conference room under dead recessed lights and built a hard, plain intake protocol that nobody loved and everybody could live with. Priority to existing family units already connected to people on site, essential skills, dependent children, and those who could travel without jeopardizing the group. No arrivals after full dark, unless previously arranged by radio. No one symptomatic allowed into the main building, observation shelter only, downhill annex, separate water. No firearms inside common areas, unless assigned security. No generators run without log entry. No one uses the reservoir alone. No rumors announced as facts over the radio room. I know that sounds severe. It was severe. But severity written in clear language is kinder than uncertainty enforced by exhaustion. Day 7 was the last day the valley felt recoverable. From the crest road that morning, I could see smoke from 2 places west of Miller Cut, and a line of vehicles on Route 8 that had stopped being traffic and become accumulation. The radio gave us pieces. The state emergency network had fallen into clipped regional chatter. Somebody in Modesto was asking for additional barriers. A transit depot in Bakersfield wanted escort for fuel movement. A hospital in Stockton was requesting water because staffing had failed in housekeeping, and nobody had realized how much a building depended on the people who moved linen and waste. That one bothered Anna for hours. She kept saying, not to anyone in particular. People think institutions fail at the top. They fail at the edges first. Around noon, a county truck came up with 2 nurses from the clinic, one dialysis patient named Mr. Kohler, with a folding oxygen concentrator, and his daughter June, who had not slept and kept apologizing for taking up space. We had known this might happen. The clinic backup power was unstable. Supply delivery had not made it up from the south. Dialysis would not be possible after a point, but that point had not yet arrived, and we were still operating in the region where an extra day of safety counted for something definite. Marta set up a quiet corner for them in the old records office, while Anna found blankets, and one of the boys offered Mr. Kohler his pillow without being asked. The old man took it with both hands and nodded as if it were a formal gift. That was when the dam stopped belonging to us as workers and became something more complicated. I remember the weather turning that evening. Fine, cold rain drifting in almost sideways, not enough to drum on the roof, just enough to darken every concrete surface and bring out old stains. Water on old infrastructure has a smell of its own, especially when dust has sat through a dry summer. The powerhouse aprons looked newly poured. The reservoir disappeared into low cloud. Inside, our lights seemed warmer than they had any right to. Theo and I spent 2 hours in the auxiliary unit room with open manuals and flashlights clamped under our arms, discussing whether an old exciter assembly could be coaxed into service for isolated internal distribution. This is the sort of thing that sounds heroic from far away, and is mostly a matter of dirty hands, uncertainty, and admitting that the dead engineers who designed something were not fools. We did not bring the turbine back online in any meaningful public sense, but by careful stages, using Leon's refurbished diesel start system, Jonah's wiring discipline, and Theo's memory of procedures no one had performed in 2 decades, we got enough controlled generation from the old house systems and auxiliary drives to supplement the diesels and battery banks. A thin return of life, no more. A hum where silence had been. But in a darkening world, that hum changed the emotional temperature of the whole building. When the first row of old indicator lamps glowed again in the control room, yellow and soft behind dusty lenses, Theo took off his cap. "I'll be damned," he said quietly. None of us spoke for a moment. It felt less like victory than like hearing an elderly person clear their throat and speak after you had assumed they were asleep. That night, I made the call to seal the dam properly. I did it because traffic on the West Road had dissolved into abandonment, because the county repeater was carrying more dead air and fewer useful instructions, because rumors were beginning to travel faster than weather, and because a place advertised as refuge becomes something else entirely once too many frightened people learn the road. A refuge with no admission standard is just a waiting room for failure. I still don't know whether that sentence makes me sound cold. I know how it felt. It felt like standing with a clipboard while the future narrowed. We kept the Crest Road passable, but not obvious. We dragged old maintenance barriers and concrete buckets into the service turnoffs below the final switchback. We covered reflective signs. We welded the lower gate in a way that could be cut from inside if needed. We moved supplies out of sight from windows. Salcedo placed observation points with binoculars and radios, not because he expected attack in some melodramatic sense, but because tired strangers make fast, bad decisions at road ends. He was right. Twice in the next 48 hours, vehicles came too far up, found the turn, blocked, idled, backed, and left. We watched from under the eaves while rain made shifting curtains in the headlights. By day 6, the outbreak reached the first farms at the mouth of the valley. I did not see that myself. We heard it over radio, and then confirmed it with binoculars from the south overlook the next morning. Stalled pickups at the feed road junction, one field burning in a low, uneven line. No movement at the gas station where there should have been someone by dawn. Pete stood beside me with my field glasses and said nothing for so long I thought he hadn't recognized his own truck. But he had. He lowered the binoculars and handed them back. "Well," he said, "there it is. What do you want to do about the Orchard pump house?" He considered. "Drain what can freeze. Leave the rest. If we go down now, we go down for memory, not utility." That was one of the cleanest things anyone said in those weeks. We did one last controlled run down the east slope that day. Pete, Salcedo, and I took 2 trucks, left before dawn, and moved through side roads we still trusted. The valley had changed in ways that were hard to quantify at first. Not ruined, not cinematic, just wrong in its pattern. Too many doors open, too many cars stopped askew, a dog running loose with a leash still on. The school parking lot half full on a day when school had been closed for nearly a week. A hose left on in somebody's front yard, making mud under a rose bush. We did not go into town center. There was no reason. Practical trips get cleaner when you stop pretending you are also witnessing history. At Anna's house, we took winter clothes, her pressure canner, 2 bags of rice from the pantry, medicine, batteries, family papers, and the seed box she kept in the hall closet, because she never trusted garages for anything that mattered. Pete drained lines at the orchard shed, loaded spare belts and tools, and stood a while in the open doorway looking at the neat rows running off into low gray light. On the way back, we passed 3 infected moving through a vineyard on the west bench, slow and arrhythmic, pausing at posts as if confused by order. They were far enough off that we only watched. One wore a reflective vest. Another had no shoes. None of them looked like movie monsters. They looked like people whose instructions had been erased, but whose legs still remembered walking. That unsettled me more than frenzy would have. Back at the dam, we began living by schedule, because schedule is one of the few dignities that survives almost anything. Breakfast at 6:30, water checks at 7, fuel and generator logs at 7:30, radio watch at 8, noon, 4, and 8, maintenance blocks mid-morning and mid-afternoon, quiet hours after 9 unless there was a road issue, laundry on alternate days using a system Anna built from wash tubs, heated water, and a wringer salvage from the museum annex in town that somehow still worked. Every person over 12 on chores. Every person under 12 on smaller versions of chores. Everybody on meal cleanup. Even Mr. Kohler, before he grew too weak, insisted on folding towels because, as he put it, I refuse to become symbolic. By then, we had 31 people at the dam. That number rose slowly, which was the only reason it remained manageable. A family from Fallon Cross with a daughter who had asthma and a father who knew refrigeration. 2 county road workers who brought chainsaws and enough practical swearing to improve morale. A librarian named Celia who arrived with 3 boxes of children's books and a pressure in her voice that suggested she had held herself together by inventorying things as long as possible. An AM radio hobbyist from the Ridge communities, Walter Pruitt, who turned out to have more useful antenna knowledge than most of the state. A baker, a welder, a pregnant woman in her 2nd trimester who knew bookkeeping better than anyone else on site, and so became, inevitably, our quartermaster. What changed the dam from shelter into settlement was not the number. It was the ordinary arguments. Someone had taken a longer shower than allotted. Someone kept leaving wet boots by the heater. The boys had turned a hallway handrail into a game. A radio log was sloppy. A pot had been scorched. A diesel drum had not been marked clearly. I do not mean to sound glib. Those frictions were evidence of survival. People only begin complaining about boot placement when they have unconsciously decided tomorrow exists. The infected remained mostly below us. Sometimes we saw them in the valley through binoculars, singly or in loose, accidental groups along roads, moving without the urgency of pursuit and without the restfulness of ordinary wandering. It became clear after a while that they were drawn by certain patterns: engine noise, concentrated light, intermittent metallic banging, and perhaps crowds themselves, though that may have just been the geometry of roads and towns making everything collect where people already were. We learned not to run the big exterior floodlights. We learned to keep generator exhaust baffled. We learned that quiet competence was safer than boldness. Around the third week, with nights colder and our systems no longer collapsing daily, we started expanding from emergency shelter into actual life. Pete and the road crew rigged a terraced garden in old aggregate bins below the maintenance shop, using topsoil hauled from a county landscaping yard. Anna organized schooling in the former briefing room, with a whiteboard salvaged from the district office. Marta built a proper water lab corner with labeled shelves and a level of stern tidiness that made grown adults nervous. Walter got a long wire antenna working along the ridge and began catching broadcasts from farther north than seemed possible, some official, some homemade, some only voices reading place names and fuel requests into static. I spent most mornings on infrastructure and most evenings walking. There is a path that skirts the upstream side of the dam, climbs above the intake towers, and runs through manzanita and decomposed granite to an old survey point on the ridge. From there, you can see the whole reservoir, and, if the light is clear, nearly to the valley floor. I started taking that walk after supper because it gave my mind one thing that no room inside the dam could provide: distance from immediate tasks without distance from responsibility. I would go up with a thermos of weak coffee, or later, when coffee became too precious, hot water with mint leaves somebody had coaxed from a planter box. The air got colder as September gave way. The reservoir turned from silver to a heavier iron blue. Once, after the first hard frost, the surface near the north inlet smoked at dawn, where colder air moved over slightly warmer water. Walking up there, I remembered things badly and fondly. My father, teaching me the names of tools by making me hand him the wrong one first. The old operator's Christmas party when I was 9 and thought the turbine floor was the grandest room I had ever seen. My first apartment above a tire shop where the radiator hissed all night. My wife, before she left, leaning over a road atlas on our kitchen table planning a vacation we never took because district work had another flood season in mind. I do not mention my wife often, because by then she was 3 years gone and living 2 counties away. And the truth is, our marriage had ended in the ordinary way marriages end, not by catastrophe, but by accumulated mismatch and exhausted apologies. Still, in quiet places, memory rarely keeps to one category. Sometimes I tried to count what sealing the dam had cost. Sometimes I counted what it had allowed. Neither sum ever stayed stable. The phrase, "sealed the dam," makes people imagine a fortress. But that isn't how most days felt. Most days felt like maintenance. Tightening a flange, repacking a valve stem, rotating stored fuel, bleaching wash basins, checking the annex roof for leaks, draining condensation from air tanks, writing names on shelves. The apocalypse, once it settled, had far less to do with dramatic moments than with the relentless appetite of systems. A toilet seal failed with exactly the same indifference after the end of the world as it had before. So did a belt tensioner. So did a child's need for routine. Around mid-October, we made our only substantial expedition across the reservoir. There had been a marina on the north arm before the county cut recreational contracts. The dock store supposedly still held marine batteries, propane, canned goods, and maybe winter tarps. The road around would have taken 6 hours and passed too close to the lower valley. By water it was safer if the weather held. Theo hated the idea of using boats on the reservoir in autumn. "Cold water doesn't care if you're scared," he kept saying. But the marina mattered enough to try. We found 2 aluminum work skiffs chained in the old boathouse below the spillway service track, both dry-rotted in spots but salvageable. Leon spent 3 days making one of the outboards honest. Pete patched the hull seams. I checked weather reports from Walter's radio catches, watched the cloud decks, and waited for a still day. When it came, I took Pete and Celia, not because she had boating experience, which she did not, but because she had a cooler head under disappointment than most people, and a librarian's exactness about inventory. We left just after sunrise. The reservoir water was black-blue and flat enough to mirror the intake towers. Going out across it, with the dam diminishing behind us and the high slopes full of dry fir and granite, the world felt older than the outbreak. That is one of the strange mercies of large water. It refuses your timeline. The marina had been abandoned in haste, but not looted thoroughly. We found batteries, rope, canned soup, water jugs, insect repellent, 2 boxes of flares, fishing line, and 6 unopened rain ponchos in a cabinet marked staff. In the office, Celia found paper charts, local maps, and a locked drawer full of registration files she stared at for a long moment, before closing again without comment. We did not stay long. There were signs of infected on the access road, footprints in dried silt, one bloodless handprint on a truck door, a smell in the still air that told us bodies somewhere had been left to weather. By noon, the wind began running down the north arm, and we turned back, the skiff heavier and slower. Halfway across, the dam reappeared around the bend, small at first, then solid, a geometry of concrete against rock. I remember feeling an embarrassing kind of gratitude toward it, as if a structure could choose to be reliable. Winter came in stages. First cold mornings, then one storm, with wet, heavy snow above the ridge. Then the long season of damp concrete, generator breath, and jackets never fully drying by the heater. We sealed off more rooms to conserve warmth. We built inner walls from salvaged insulation board in the dormitory corridor. Anna organized evening readings for the children because darkness came too early, and idle hours were hard on everybody. Walter's radio room became a place people drifted to, not only for information, but for the comfort of voices from beyond our bowl of mountains. Some nights he caught communities establishing exchange frequencies. Some nights only static, and one far-off weather band repeating pressure readings from a dead station. Mr. Kohler died on the first clear night after the season's second frost. He had outlived the point anyone expected, mostly through stubbornness and June's care. He died in his sleep under 2 wool blankets in the former records room, with the oxygen concentrator silent because we had been saving power, and because, by then, the machine no longer made a meaningful difference. June came to get me before dawn because she thought, correctly, that I would know what paperwork no longer mattered, and what practical things still did. There is no graceful way to describe death in a small enclosed community, except to say that systems continue while tenderness makes room around them. Anna lit the corridor lamps low. Marta checked on the children before rumors could get there first. Pete and I built a box from clean plywood in the shop because the ground above the ridge had frozen too hard for digging by hand, and because leaving a body waiting felt worse. Salcedo read something short at the overlook that afternoon, hat in both hands, breath smoking. June asked if we could face him toward the valley, even though the grave line did not technically run that way. We did. Afterward, people were quieter for several days, Not shattered, just thin in the voice. The dam itself seemed louder. Pumps cycling, radiator tick, wind under the eaves. The boys stopped running in hallways. Celia put books out on the common room table without announcing it. Leon fixed a loose chair rung nobody had asked him to fix. Grief in practical communities often arrives disguised as maintenance. By the time snow held on the north slope, we had 48 people. That was near our comfortable limit, and close enough to our hard one that I stopped counting beds and started counting margins. Fuel margin, food margin, water treatment margin, patience margin. We expanded the garden bins into a small greenhouse using old window panels and the steel frames from decommissioned equipment housings. We bartered by radio with a ridge settlement for dried beans in exchange for chlorine tablets and a repaired inverter. Pete and the road crew built a sled system for hauling heavier loads from the upper gate in snow. Jonah rigged a bicycle generator for radio backup, and then discovered half the children wanted to take turns charging batteries because useful labor feels good when the world has become abstractly frightening. Did I regret sealing the dam? Yes, in moments. More than once. There were days when vehicles appeared at the lower road, and we did not answer because we had no protocol for strangers after dark, and no certainty they were uninfected, and no way to house them without breaking every rule that kept the rest alive. We watched from above while headlights idled, swung, and vanished. Once a woman on foot reached the first barrier before dawn and shouted up that there was a child with her. Salcedo and I went down in masks with the observation shelter prepared and found no child, only a feverish woman clutching a coat to her chest and weeping with rage because we would not bring her into the main building. She tried to bite Salcedo when he guided her toward the annex. She died there by afternoon. Not turned, not as far as we could tell, just spent and far gone with infection of another kind. That one stayed with him, with both of us. There was no clean line between caution and cruelty. Anyone who says there was did not carry keys. Still, the dam held. That is not a small sentence to me. It held against weather. It held against neglect. It held against our ignorance, which was considerable. It held because old concrete had been overbuilt by men with federal budgets and long memories of flood. It held because Theo remembered valve sequences nobody had written down clearly enough. It held because Marta would not compromise on water. It held because Anna understood that children and old people create the moral temperature of a place. It held because Pete could look at a limited supply and speak about it without shame. It held because Leon thought every failing machine still deserved one honest try. It held because Salcedo knew when to say no before hoping became a hazard. It held, I suppose, because I made the first decision early, before fear became a crowd. I'm aware of how that sounds. I'm not making myself the hero of it. Early decisions are not always wise. They are just early. Mine happened to line up with what the valley became. The spring after the outbreak, when snowmelt began filling the upper arms and the first alder shoots showed pale along the runoff channels, we opened the crest road in daylight for the first time in months. Not fully, not as a welcome, more as an acknowledgement that our settlement had moved from emergency into duration. By then, several other communities had stabilized across the region. Walter's radio logs included call signs we trusted. Trade routes of a sort had formed, measured more in mules, skiffs, and cautious truck runs than in anything grand. The valley floor remained mostly lost, though isolated farms still signaled now and then from east benches with mirrors or lantern code. One afternoon in late April, I walked with the boys, who were no longer boys in their minds, though still were in mine, down to the old loading bay. Grass had begun pushing through cracks in the apron. The snow line had retreated upslope. One of them asked me if I had known, really known, when I first drove up with the flatbed, that this place would become home. I told him the truth. No, I said. I thought it might become a better problem than the others. He considered that a while, hands in pockets. Is that what home is? Sometimes, I said. Years have passed since then, more than I usually bother counting. We never restored the big turbines, not truly. We made one auxiliary system productive enough to carry lights, tools, refrigeration, and a few luxuries when snowmelt was good. We planted more terraces. We roofed over the old aggregate bins and turned them into workshops. We painted wayfinding arrows in the corridors because children kept growing into adults who needed to remember where they had first slept. The chalkboard in the kitchen became a painted wall, and then, eventually, a set of proper ledgers, because Celia insisted that institutions begin in handwriting and graduate to record-keeping if they intend to remain kind. Theo died in his bed in the operator's wing 3 winters after Mr. Kohler, with one manual open on his lap and his glasses folded carefully beside him, as if he had stepped away from a task rather than left it. Salcedo lost weight, and most of his patience, but none of his judgment. Marta's hair went nearly white at the temples, and she claimed it was because all of us preferred making work for her to following labeled instructions. Anna started a seed library in old parts drawers. Pete found a way to graft dwarf apple stock on the south terraces, where I had once sworn nothing useful would grow in that wind. As for me, I still walk the crest at night. I do it less from duty now than habit. The reservoir changes with season and moon. In summer, it lies heavy and black under stars. In winter, it takes on the dull sheen of metal. The intake towers still rise from it, like patient sentries. Some nights, when the auxiliary system is carrying a little more load, the control room down below glows again through cleaned windows, and I can see reflections of indicator lamps on the polished edges of panels we once thought would never wake. Below the dam, the valley goes dark, in longer stretches than it used to, then shows a lantern, a greenhouse glow, a moving pair of lights where a truck has made a road viable again. I don't romanticize that. Recovery is not a sunrise. It is plumbing, and burial, and repaired bridges, and deciding how much of the old world deserved to come back in the same shape. We are still answering that. People sometimes ask whether I regret sealing the dam before the outbreak, but not always. I understand why. A closed gate is a simple object to hate from the wrong side of it. What I tell them is this: 11 days before the valley changed, I drove up a mountain to an abandoned hydroelectric station because I understood water, walls, fuel, and weather better than I understood people in panic. I did not go up there to choose who mattered. I went up there because systems fail in order, and if you catch even one of them early enough, you can carve out a little time for decency. Decency turned out not to be soft. It turned out to be lists, hard conversations, hand-washing, repaired pumps, shared meals, and a willingness to say both yes and no for reasons you could explain under decent light. It turned out to be children doing arithmetic in a conference room while the old generator coughed below. It turned out to be Marta tapping chlorine residuals into a notebook every morning as if chemistry itself were a form of prayer. It turned out to be Salcedo walking the gate in sleet because someone had to. It turned out to be Theo putting his hand on a dead control panel and showing us which parts of the past were still willing to work. When the wind is right, I can still hear that spillway elevator door I sealed on the first day. Not rattling anymore, just holding. It is a small sound inside a large structure, a quiet human correction made before everything became difficult. I think about that a lot. Not because it was brave. It wasn't. It was ordinary. a gasket, a wheel latch, a bit of care where air had been getting in. Most survival in the end looked like that. And on cold nights, when the younger ones are asleep in rooms that used to belong to operators whose names have mostly faded from the boards, and the reservoir sits dark beyond the intake towers, and the old dam makes its deep, patient sounds around us. I stand on the crest with my hands in my coat pockets and look down into the valley we lost and partly found again. Then I go back inside, where the lights are low. The heaters tick softly in their metal cages. Somebody has left a mug to dry upside down by the sink, and the building, against reason, against neglect, against the long arithmetic of history, goes on humming.